The reason most English learners never sound natural, no matter how many years they study, is because they are using a method that was never designed to build real fluency. Cold War spy agencies cracked the code on building flawless, accentless English in months using a technique that has nothing to do with grammar books. And today, we are breaking down exactly how it worked. Okay, Emma, I have a question for you. When you first started learning Spanish, what was the very first thing your teacher told you to do?
Oh, that's easy. Buy a textbook, memorize verb conjugations, and work through exercises at the end of each chapter.
Right. And how well did that actually work for you?
Honestly, after about 6 months of doing exactly that, I could conjugate verbs perfectly on paper, but I could not order food in a restaurant without completely freezing up. It was embarrassing.
Okay, so here is what is wild. There were people during the Cold War, actual intelligence operatives, spies, who went from speaking broken, heavily accented English to sounding completely native. And they did it in months. No textbooks, no grammar drills, just a completely different method.
Wait, for real?
For real. And today we are going to break down exactly what that method was, the science behind why it works, and how you can use it right now to improve your English.
I am already hooked. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to the Fluent English Podcast. I'm Alex.
And I'm Emma. If you're new here, this is where we have real, natural conversations in everyday American English, so you can build your listening comprehension just by tuning in and listening to us talk.
No scripts, no slow speech, no artificial pauses, just two people having a normal conversation. And today's topic is genuinely one of my favorites.
Tell me the topic.
The Cold War spy method. More specifically, how Cold War-era intelligence agencies trained deep-cover operatives to speak flawless, accentless English in a very short amount of time.
Deep cover. That is a great phrase. For our listeners, deep cover means an agent who is living completely undercover, not just gathering information on the side, but actually pretending to be a different person, full-time for years or even decades.
Right. So these were not people who went to an evening English class twice a week. These were people whose lives literally depended on sounding exactly like native speakers. One wrong word, one strange pronunciation, one unnatural pause, and their cover was blown.
And having your cover blown could mean arrest, imprisonment, or worse.
So the stakes could not have been higher. And when the stakes are that high, you do not mess around with grammar workbooks.
Okay, before we get into the actual method, I want to hear about a real case. You mentioned there was a famous spy who actually pulled this off, not just for a few months, but for years.
Yes. So the person I want to talk about is Rudolf Abel. Now, his real name was William Henrikovich Fischer, and he was a Soviet intelligence officer. He was actually born in England to Russian parents, but he was raised and trained in the Soviet Union and eventually became a KGB operative.
Wait, he was born in England?
Born in England, yes, but he spent most of his life in the Soviet Union working for Soviet intelligence, and when the KGB sent him to the United States in the late 1940s, he had to reinvent himself completely. He took on the identity of a man named Emil Goldfuss, presenting himself as a quiet, cultured American artist and photographer living in Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn. That is a very specific, very local identity.
Exactly. And here is what is remarkable about this. He lived in Brooklyn for years. He had neighbors, he had acquaintances, people he ran into regularly, people he had conversations with, and none of them suspected a thing. They just thought he was a slightly reserved, interesting guy who liked to paint.
So his English was genuinely that good?
His English was that good. Native-level fluency, no detectable accent. And he was not just speaking basic survival English. He was having complex conversations, understanding humor, picking up on cultural references, all of it.
And he was eventually caught.
He was eventually caught, yes. But here is the thing. It was not his language that gave him away. He was turned in by an informant, someone on the inside who reported him to the FBI. His English, his accent, his way of speaking, none of that ever raised a single red flag.
The word informant is interesting. Can you break that down?
Sure. An informant is someone who secretly provides information to the authorities about another person, usually someone they know. It is different from a witness who simply sees something and reports it. An informant is generally someone on the inside, someone with access.
Good distinction.
So, Rudolf Abel was arrested in 1957, tried as a Soviet spy, and sentenced to 30 years in a federal prison. But he only served a few years because in 1962 he was exchanged for the American U-2 spy plane pilot Francis Gary Powers in a famous prisoner exchange on the Glienicke Bridge in Germany. That bridge is actually where the phrase "Bridge of Spies" comes from.
Oh, so that is the movie title.
Exactly. The 2015 Tom Hanks film is based on that exchange, and the American lawyer who negotiated it on the U.S. side, James Donovan, is the main character.
Okay, so Rudolf Abel, Soviet spy, lived in Brooklyn as a completely convincing American, and his language never once gave him away. How did he do it? How does anyone do that?
So this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, and I want to start with the core concept before we get into the actual techniques.
Go for it.
The core concept is this. The traditional way of learning a language, the way most language schools teach it, starts with rules. You learn grammar first, then vocabulary, then you try to apply those rules when you speak. And there is a fundamental problem with that approach.
What is the problem?
Native speakers do not use rules when they speak. Nobody is consciously conjugating a verb in the middle of a conversation. Native speech is automatic. It is muscle memory. It is pattern recognition. It happens before you have time to think.
That is so true. When someone asks me something in Spanish, I know the grammatically correct answer in my head, but by the time I have thought it through and assembled the sentence, the moment has already passed and the conversation has moved on.
Exactly. You are processing the language cognitively, meaning through deliberate conscious thinking, instead of intuitively, meaning automatically, without having to think about it. And spy training was specifically designed to bypass that cognitive stage entirely.
And how do you bypass it?
By recreating the same conditions that babies experience when they learn their first language. Think about how a child learns to speak. They do not study grammar. There is no textbook. They are just immersed in sound constantly for months and months before they ever produce a meaningful word. And the brain, especially a young brain, is wired to extract patterns from that sound, not rules, patterns.
So the spy training was trying to simulate that early childhood immersion, but in an adult brain?
Precisely. And the key ingredient that made it work, the thing that most people overlook when they talk about immersion, was not just the exposure to language. It was the emotional intensity that came with it.
What do you mean by emotional intensity?
This is where the neuroscience comes in. There is a well-documented phenomenon in brain research related to neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to reorganize itself and form new connections in response to learning and experience. And what the research consistently shows is that the brain learns fastest when it is operating under a certain level of emotional engagement or stress.
Hold on. Stress actually helps you learn faster?
Not all stress. Too much stress shuts your brain down completely, but a moderate, optimal level of stress, what psychologists sometimes call optimal arousal, actually enhances memory formation and accelerates pattern recognition.
So too relaxed and you don't retain things, too stressed and you shut down, but somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot.
Exactly. Think about it this way. If I ask you what you had for breakfast 3 Tuesdays ago, you probably have no idea.
Completely blank.
But if on that particular Tuesday you had knocked your coffee all over yourself right before an important job interview, you would remember every single detail of that morning for years.
Oh, that is a perfect analogy. And by the way, an analogy is a comparison that helps explain something abstract by linking it to something familiar and concrete.
Great. So emotionally charged memories are far more durable than ordinary memories, and spy training deliberately exploited this. Operatives were placed in high-stakes situations where they had to perform in English under real pressure. The emotional weight of the situation did not just motivate them, it actually accelerated the formation of new language patterns in the brain.
So when you are genuinely afraid that one wrong word could blow your cover, your brain is working at a completely different level to get it right.
And your brain is simultaneously forming much stronger neural pathways around the correct patterns because the emotional stakes are reinforcing them. Neural pathways are essentially the connections between individual neurons in your brain. The more you activate a particular pathway, especially under emotionally significant conditions, the stronger, faster, and more automatic it becomes.
So the spy's brain was literally rewiring itself to speak English without having to think about it.
That is exactly what was happening. And this is what neuroscientists mean when they talk about neuroplasticity under high-stakes emotional duress. The word duress means pressure or hardship caused by a threatening or stressful situation. Under genuine duress, the brain changes faster than it does in comfortable, low-stakes conditions.
Okay, this is fascinating. So what were the actual techniques? What did operatives actually do in training?
There were two main techniques that appear repeatedly in declassified training documents and in accounts from former intelligence officers. The first one you have probably heard of, at least in passing: shadowing.
I have heard that word before in language learning. What does it mean in this context?
So shadowing, in its basic form, means you listen to a native speaker and you repeat what they are saying almost simultaneously, like a shadow following someone just a step behind. You're not waiting for them to finish, you're speaking along with them, just a fraction of a second after they say each word.
That sounds really hard.
It is extremely hard, and the difficulty is the entire point. Because to do shadowing properly, you can't be thinking about grammar. There is no time. You have to be processing sound and producing sound at the same time, and your brain has to do it on instinct. And as a result, it starts to absorb the rhythm, the stress patterns, the intonation, the pacing, all of the things that make speech sound natural.
Intonation is the way your pitch rises and falls when you speak, right? The musical quality of language?
Exactly. And intonation is one of the most significant things that gives away a non-native speaker, even when their vocabulary is perfect and their grammar is flawless. If your intonation is wrong, you still sound foreign. It is one of the last things learners master and one of the first things native ears notice.
That is something I have experience with my Spanish. I can say the words correctly now, I can string sentences together, but I still sound American because my intonation is still off, my rising and falling patterns are not quite right.
And shadowing is probably the most direct way to fix that, because you're not just learning what words to say, you are training your mouth, your ear, and your voice to physically reproduce the exact rhythms and sounds of native speech.
Okay, shadowing is technique number 1. What is number 2?
High-frequency chunking. This one is less famous, but in some ways it is even more powerful.
High-frequency chunking. Break that down.
So high frequency simply means the things that occur most often, and chunking, in the context of language, means grouping certain words together and treating them as a single unit rather than as individual pieces. A chunk is basically a phrase or expression that native speakers store and retrieve as one complete thing, without breaking it apart.
Like, by the way, or on the other hand, or as a matter of fact.
Perfect examples. When you say, by the way, you are not consciously thinking by, pause, the, pause, way. It comes out as one piece, one single chunk of language. And native speakers have thousands of these stored in their brain. When they speak, they are essentially pulling chunks and assembling them, not constructing sentences one word at a time.
So when a non-native speaker builds a sentence word by word, it sounds slightly off even if every individual word is correct?
That is exactly it. And that slight offness is what makes someone sound like they are translating in their head, even when their vocabulary is strong. The pauses are in the wrong places. The combinations feel a little stiff. Spy training addressed this directly by drilling operatives specifically on the highest frequency chunks in American English, the phrases that Native Americans use constantly in everyday speech.
What are some examples of those?
Things like, what are you up to? That makes sense. I see what you mean. It is kind of like. Honestly, though, to be fair, I was just about to. That said, it is not that I don't. These are not on any vocabulary list. They are not in any textbook, but they are all over every real conversation.
And learning those phrases as complete units, not word by word, is what makes someone start to sound genuinely natural.
Right, because when you know that makes sense as a chunk, you produce it instantly, at the right speed, with the right stress. It sounds automatic because it is automatic. You are not translating or assembling anything, you are just retrieving a unit you already know.
This is making me think about my Spanish learning differently. I spend so much time learning individual words and not nearly enough time learning whole phrases the way native speakers actually use them.
It is a really common gap, and it's actually one of the reasons that people who learn language through lots of listening, through TV shows, through music, through real conversations, often end up sounding more natural than people who only study formally, because exposure to real language builds your chunk library naturally.
The informal learners are accidentally doing chunking.
Exactly. The spy training just made it deliberate and systematic. Now, can I ask you something?
Of course.
You were learning Spanish, and I've been trying to improve my French. Do you find yourself doing either of these techniques naturally at this point?
Yes, actually. The shadowing has become a habit for me. Every morning, I put on a Spanish podcast, and I shadow along for about 15 minutes while I'm getting ready. It feels a little silly because I'm basically talking to myself, but my accent and my pronunciation have improved more in the last 3 months from that than from years of studying grammar.
And for me, with French, I've shifted to learning phrases instead of individual words. Like instead of just adding actually to my vocabulary, I learned the chunk en fait, in context, in a full sentence, the way a French person would actually use it in conversation. And it sticks so much better.
Because you're learning the word in its natural habitat.
Exactly. And by the way, I want to mention something about the spy training context that is worth understanding. The operatives were not doing 15 minutes of shadowing in the morning. They were doing hours of it, every single day, in environments specifically designed to increase the stakes and the emotional engagement.
What did those environments look like?
Based on accounts from former intelligence officers and some declassified program details, trainees were placed in highly controlled environments with very limited outside contact. In some programs, they were required to speak only in the target language at all times, even when thinking out loud, even when speaking to themselves, no exceptions. Some programs involved significant social isolation, which created a kind of psychological pressure that made language acquisition faster.
That is essentially sensory deprivation, but with language as your only anchor.
In some cases, quite literally. And the point was not cruelty. The point was that when your brain has no option but to operate in a specific language, and when there is real emotional pressure attached to doing it correctly, the learning is dramatically accelerated.
Because the brain adapts to survive.
That is the most accurate way to put it. The brain adapts to survive. And that is neuroplasticity under duress in a very real, very literal sense.
Okay, so we have talked about the concept, we have talked about the science, we have talked about the two main techniques. Let's make this actually practical for people listening. If someone hearing this right now wants to use the SPY method to improve their English, what should they do?
Here's how I would structure it. Step 1. Choose your audio source. And I want to be specific here. You need real, natural English, not textbook recordings, not slow news anchor English, not simplified learner content, real conversations, podcasts, YouTube channels, TV shows, movies, anything with genuine, natural American speech. And ideally, choose something you actually find interesting because your level of emotional engagement with the content matters.
And this podcast, just saying, is a good place to start.
This podcast absolutely counts. Step 2, begin shadowing. Start with a short clip, 1 to 2 minutes of natural speech. Shadow along with it. And here's something important. You do not need to understand every single word to benefit from shadowing. Your goal in those minutes is not comprehension. Your goal is to reproduce the sounds, the rhythm, the pace, the intonation. Do this for 10 to 15 minutes a day consistently.
What do you do if you come across a word or phrase you simply cannot catch?
At the beginning, you let it go and keep moving. Your brain is still absorbing patterns, even when you are not consciously aware of it. Think about how a very young child hears the phrase, "I love you," hundreds of times before they understand what it means. The meaning arrives later, after the pattern is already embedded.
Okay, step 3.
Step 3 is building your chunk library. Every day, take 5 to 10 common English phrases and learn them as complete units. Do not just note down the meaning. Say each one out loud multiple times. Put it in a realistic sentence. If you can, use it in an actual conversation with someone. And focus on phrases that come up in real everyday speech, not formal or academic phrases.
Can you give some specific examples of great chunks for intermediate English learners?
Sure, some great ones. I was just about to, as in, I was just about to text you. That said, as in, that said, I think we should give it a try. It is not that I don't, as in, it is not that I don't want to help, I just don't have time right now. Fair enough, as in, fair enough, I can see your point. I have to say, as in, I have to say, that was really impressive. These are all very common, very natural, and almost impossible to pick up from a textbook.
Those are really practical. And step 4?
Step 4 is the emotional engagement component. And I want to be clear that this does not mean putting yourself under harmful stress, but the research is consistent. Learning that happens under slightly elevated emotional stakes is faster and sticks longer. So find situations where you have a real reason to get your English right. A conversation with a native speaker, a voice message you record and send, reading something out loud and recording yourself, then listening back. Any situation where there's a small but genuine reason to perform.
You're saying the feeling of nervousness before a real English conversation is actually useful.
It is not just useful. For many people, it is the missing ingredient. And I want to say something directly to anyone listening who feels anxious when they have to speak English in a real situation. That anxiety is not a sign that something is wrong with you or that you are not good enough. That is your brain entering a heightened state of attention. That is the same state the spies were trained to operate in. Rudolf Abel did not become an undetectable native speaker despite the pressure he was under. He became one because of it.
That is genuinely a reframe I needed to hear, even as someone who has been speaking English my whole life and is now learning a second language. The nervousness is the point.
And the last thing I would add is time. Consistency over time. Rudolf Abel did not arrive in Brooklyn sounding perfectly native on day one. The training programs ran for months. The combination of daily shadowing, daily chunk building, and real stakes conversation practice done consistently is what produces that level of fluency. There is no shortcut to the shortcut.
Right. The SPY method is faster than a textbook, but it still requires actual effort and actual time.
Exactly. It is just effort spent in a much smarter, much more neurologically aligned direction.
This has been such a great episode. I feel like I want to go shadow a Spanish podcast right now.
Same. My French is about to get the SPY treatment.
Before we close out, let's do our vocabulary review. We covered a lot of keywords today, so let's lock them in.
I will start. Deep cover. This describes a form of undercover work where a person completely conceals their true identity and genuinely lives as a different person over a long period of time. Example, the operative spent 7 years in deep cover, building a completely false life.
Informant. A person who secretly provides information to the authorities about someone else, usually from the inside of a group or organization. Example, the spy ring was exposed when one of its own members became an FBI informant.
Neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout a person's life in response to learning, experience, or environmental changes. Example, research on neuroplasticity has shown that adult brains are far more adaptable than scientists once believed.
Duress. A state of urgency, pressure, or coercion caused by a difficult or threatening situation. Example, decisions made under duress are often less reliable than those made in calm conditions.
Shadowing. A language learning technique where the learner listens to a native speaker and repeats the speech almost simultaneously, just a fraction of a second behind, focusing on rhythm, intonation, and sound rather than grammar. Example, after 2 months of daily shadowing, his pronunciation had dramatically improved.
Chunking. In language learning, the practice of learning phrases or expressions as single, complete units rather than as individual words. Example, instead of just learning the word however, she learned the full chunk that said, however, as it naturally appears in conversation.
Intonation, the rise and fall of the voice across a spoken sentence. Intonation communicates meaning, emotion, and intent in ways that individual words alone cannot. Example, she said fine, but her intonation made it clear that everything was not fine.
Neural pathways. The connections between neurons in the brain. These pathways are strengthened each time a particular thought, action, or pattern is repeated, making that pattern faster and more automatic over time. Example, musicians develop exceptionally strong neural pathways related to timing and motor coordination.
Cognitive, relating to conscious mental processes such as thinking, reasoning, understanding, and remembering. Example, the cognitive effort required to translate in your head slows down real conversations significantly.
And finally, analogy, a comparison between two things used to explain something unfamiliar by relating it to something the listener already understands. Example, the teacher used the analogy of a muscle to explain how the brain grows stronger through repeated practice.
10 words, all picked up in context, the way real learning happens.
Which is exactly why this show exists.
All right, that is a wrap on today's episode. If you want to start using the SPY method, the action step is simple. Shadow for 15 minutes today. Find a clip of natural English speech, press play, and talk along with it. That is it. That is where it starts.
And if this episode was useful to you, share it with someone who is working on their English. That is the best thing you can do for this community.
We will see you next time.
Keep listening, keep practicing, and remember, the nervousness you feel when you speak is not holding you back.
It is what moves you forward. Bye, everyone.
Bye.